Hello guys, Bingocat here. So today's video is going to be another old school operating systems comparison video. Today I will be comparing Windows XP Professional to Windows 7 Professional. Now honestly, this kind of video would have probably been more relevant back in 2009 when Windows 7 came out because Vista was hated by a lot of people. Vista was known for being buggy, unstable. A lot of older drivers from before 2006 wouldn't work in Windows Vista at all. And the system requirements for Windows Vista were just simply too high at the time. Basically, Vista was a mess. And so when Windows 7 came out, people were really skeptical whether Windows 7 would solve a lot of the problems that Vista had. And for the most part, Windows 7 did. Windows 7 was well received and is the world's most widely used operating system now, especially since Windows XP support ended. So the minimum requirements to run both operating systems. Windows XP was released in October of 2001, and at the time it had the minimum requirements for Windows XP are a Pentium 233 MHz processor or faster, at least 64 megabytes of RAM, at least 1.5 gigabytes of available hard disk space, a CD-ROM or DVD-ROM drive, keyboard and Microsoft mouse or other compatible pointing device, and a video adapter and monitor with Super VGA, which is 800 by 600 or higher resolution. Now Windows 7 was released around 8 years later than Windows XP. If you want to run Windows 7 on your PC, you need a 1 GHz or faster 32-bit x86 processor or 64-bit processor, 1 GB of RAM for the 32-bit version of Windows 7 or 2 GB of RAM for the 64-bit version of Windows 7, 16 GB of available hard disk space for the 32-bit OS or 20 GB for the 64-bit OS, and a DirectX 9 graphics device with WDDM 1.0 or higher driver. Now, the system requirements for both operating systems are honestly way too low. The system requirements for Windows XP were, it was okay when it came out back in 2001. My dad had a, I think, Pentium 3 computer with 128 megabytes of RAM from like 1999 that had like maybe a 20 gigabyte hard disk drive. And Windows XP worked on there. It wasn't the fastest in the entire world, but it still worked. But if you tried to use Windows XP in like 2012 or 2013 with modern applications like Google Chrome or the newer versions of Microsoft Office, those system requirements would have been without a doubt way too low. Back in 2012 or 2013, I would have recommended for a minimum amount of RAM for Windows XP to be 2 gigabytes. And 4 gigabytes would have been a lot better, but 2 really should have been the minimum if you were interested in running Windows XP in 2012 or 2013. Or today, 64 megabytes of RAM simply just doesn't cut it anymore. And honestly, a 233 megahertz processor would have been probably okay back in 2001, but nowadays you'll probably want to go, over like 1.5 or 1.6 gigahertz if you wanted to run Windows XP with any kind of somewhat modern applications at all. Now, Windows 7 was released 8 years after Windows XP roughly, and its system requirements were a lot more than Windows XP. Windows 7's was really more similar to Windows Vista, which was a huge increase over Windows XP's, and was part of the reason why Windows Vista was initially so unpopular, because these system requirements to run Windows Vista at the time were initially too high. Most people didn't have computers that could run an operating system like that yet, which is part of the reason why Windows Vista was hugely unpopular. Now, Windows 7, when it came out, the hardware finally caught up during those last 3 years before Windows 7 came out to run an operating system of this caliber. And so that's part of the reason why Windows 7 was a lot more popular than Windows Vista is. But the system requirements, the minimum requirements to run Windows 7 are still way too low. They recommend, like, for example, 2 gigabytes of RAM for the 64-bit version of the operating system. I recommend an absolute minimum in 2017 of at least 8 gigabytes of RAM. An absolute minimum. You should not go lower than that. no matter what. Yes, you can get by with 4 gigabytes of RAM, but it will not be as smooth of an experience. Like I said in my last video, I don't care if it's for an 85-year-old grandma and all she does is do some shopping on the internet, or if it's for your 5-year-old little sister or 5-year-old daughter or whatever that only plays Minecraft. Get above the minimum requirements for your operating system if possible, okay? So let's go ahead and turn this on, and let's ignore this error message. And now, even though Windows 7 is really fast booting, Windows XP should win the boot race because I gave it similar system specs to Windows 7, and Windows 7 is a heavier operating system. The background of Windows XP, which is called Bliss, by the way, for those of you who don't know, but I think the majority of you who are watching my channel do know, Bliss was an actual real photograph taken of a field back in 1997 by a photographer named Charles O'Rear, and this thing it's beautiful. It's probably one of the most iconic pictures of all time. Now, I have no idea how they made the Windows 7 background. It's not nearly as iconic. It still looks good, but you know, this was obviously made in Photoshop or something like that. So, looking at both operating systems, Windows XP versus Windows 7. At first glance, they both look really similar, but obviously the aesthetics between both operating systems are also quite different. If you just take a look at the icons, for example, Windows XP's, they don't look bad, but they look a little tiny bit more pixelated. Windows 7's look a little bit more modern, even though these are also technically out of date now. The icons for Windows 7 are more or less the same icons that you could find in Windows Vista, and Windows Vista is a 10-year-old operating system, and as of now, isn't even supported by Microsoft. So the aesthetics of Windows 7 are technically outdated, even though I still really like them. I still think Windows Vista and Windows 7 are among the most beautiful operating systems ever created by any company. The default user interface for Windows XP is called the Windows Luna theme. I have no idea why it was called the Luna theme, but basically, before Windows XP, like from Windows 95 to Windows 2000, they used something called what's known in XP as a Windows Classic style, but before then was just the default style of Windows, where you notice how the windows are sort of, I guess, a chromish color with this sort of blue title bar here, and both Windows XP and Windows 7 does have a classic theme included, so that way, you know, if you still want your sort of chromish colored windows with your blue title bar, you can get that in both Windows XP and Windows 7. I think the one in Windows XP looks a little tiny bit better because it looks more like the one in Windows 2000 and Windows 98, and it just feels more, I guess, classic-y to me. The one in Windows 7 still looks too, I guess, modern. It doesn't feel as nice to me as the one in Windows XP, but the default theme for Windows XP is the Luna theme. I don't mind the Luna theme. I don't think it looks good. A lot of people, when this operating system came out, didn't really like the Luna themes. They didn't like the weird sort of bolded blue or whatever, and they basically said that this looks more like a Fisher-Price operating system. The user interface looks like it was for little kids. It didn't look, it didn't look professional. It didn't really have much of a point. I do kind of agree with those statements, but on the plus side, even though Windows XP, the Luna interface didn't look that good, it was a change. It was the first major change to the Windows user interface since 1995, and even though it was only 6 years, it was still nice to see Microsoft do something different with Windows. Now, the default user interface for Windows 7, which is extremely similar to the user interface in Vista, is called the Aero Interface, and I love Aero. I kind of wish they kept Aero in Windows 10, but Aero is what's responsible for this translucency effects when you move around windows, and it actually makes sense, unlike the one in Windows XP, which just felt kind of pointless. Because when you think about it, the Aero interface, you can see through the the translucency effect is called Aero Glass. You can see through the glass when in these windows, so it's like you're seeing through actual windows. It was just really a clever way of thinking of the user interface. But the problem with Aero back when it came out in 2006 was that a lot of graphics drivers weren't really equipped to run Windows Aero, which is part of the reason why Windows Vista was so unpopular, because Windows Aero is part of the reason why, Windows Vista looked so much cooler than Windows XP. Microsoft even advertised Windows Aero, is that it just looked so cool. And it probably doesn't seem as cool anymore compared to when it first came out, because Aero has existed for over 10 years now. But Windows 7, and for that matter, Windows Vista, just looks so pretty. Like, if I were to change the background to, like, landscapes, it just looks so pretty. And then you can change it to blue to match the, match the background a little bit better. I'm just going to go ahead and change it back to the default. But, it's just an overall pretty operating system. Windows 7 had probably my favorite user interface out of any Microsoft operating system ever released, and I do like it better than Windows 10's, even though Windows 10 does look more modern. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the good old start menu for both operating systems. As you can see, they're functionality-wise, they're pretty much the exact same. I mean, obviously it looks a little bit different, but functionality-wise, they're both the exact same. They both have links to some commonly accessed folders like Documents, Your Computer. Windows XP, they call it My Documents, My Computer, whatever. Something I do like about the Windows 7 Start menu, though, over XP's, and the same thing was true with Vista, is they have an integrated search box, so if I wanted to search for Internet Explorer, bam, it pops right there. If I wanted to search for Internet Explorer in Windows XP, I have to click search here. Then I'd have to, type my search query into here. And honestly, the built-in search in Windows XP, the one with this little dog here, it honestly sucked. It very rarely finds the file you're looking for as fast as you'd like it to, especially if you're on an older computer with a mechanical hard drive. I mean, my computer has an NVMe SSD, so obviously it was lightning quick. But on older computers, the search wasn't that good. But it still did find Internet Explorer really quickly, but not as quick as the Windows 7 search did. And the other major thing you'll notice that's different is if you expand the All Programs list in Windows XP versus Windows 7. In Windows XP, the All Programs list sort of cascades out, which I really like. I think it's pretty neat. I like being able to see the folder categories and my programs at the exact same time. The only problem with doing a cascading menu like this is if there are so many folders, if a program is in so many folders and it keeps cascading out and out, eventually it's going to have to keep cascading back this way, and it's going to block already sort of opened menus, and that just isn't that good. But the Windows 7 Start menu, on the other hand, when you click the All Programs list, it doesn't cascade out. It just keeps it in the Start menu over here. And I wouldn't say I like that better. It's really something that I really don't care which way it works. But, it works for Windows 7, but I really wish I could see more stuff at once instead of having to scroll up and down. I mean, you can make the Windows 7 Start menu bigger, though. You just can't do it. I mean, you just can't do it by dragging up and down the Start menu like you can in Windows 10. But yeah, that's basically the Start menu for both operating systems. So let's go ahead and take a look at the good old default web browser of both operating systems. Windows XP shipped with Internet Explorer 6, which was brand new when Windows XP came out. It was basically the launch platform for Internet Explorer 6. But this is not Internet Explorer 6, this is Internet Explorer 8, which came out in around March of 2009, where Windows 7 launched with Internet Explorer 8, but is able to run the latest and greatest version of Internet Explorer 11, which came out in late 2013, which honestly, I wouldn't recommend running anymore. It's simply, in my opinion, Microsoft hasn't really updated they keep providing IE 11 with security updates, but they don't really provide it with like layout engine updates. And Microsoft, they're really pushing their new Edge web browser, but unfortunately, long story short, you can't run Edge in Windows 7 no matter what. So the only web browser Microsoft supports in Windows 7 is Internet Explorer 11, and honestly, I just wouldn't recommend running it. I would go ahead and download Firefox or Google Chrome and just be done with it. And same thing with Windows XP, because Internet Explorer 8 is 8 years old as of this time of recording. I just don't recommend running it. I recommend downloading Firefox, even though Mozilla isn't releasing new versions of Firefox for XP anymore. I mean, you could download Opera as well. It would definitely be a heck of a lot better than Internet Explorer. Now, back when Windows 7 ran Internet Explorer 8, it looked really similar to the Windows XP version of Internet Explorer 8, but now that it's on IE 11, it looks obviously a lot different. For the most part, by default, the IE 11 Internet Explorer does look simpler than the IE 8 Internet Explorer. Now, you can always turn off all this stuff like the menu bar, the favorites bar, all this stuff, and bam, makes it look simpler. It almost looks as clean as the Internet Explorer included in Windows 7. Not as clean, I guess, but basically, I guess Internet Explorer 8 I just wouldn't recommend using anymore. It doesn't, I guess, render stuff as well. Let's take a quick look at File Explorer on both operating systems. Except in both Windows XP and Windows 7, they're called Windows Explorer. Windows Explorer for both operating systems. If you never used computers before, it would probably, it probably wouldn't make sense at first, but eventually you'll find your way around. It's not that hard in the end, I guess. Let's take a look at some of the default included programs on both operating systems. For the most part, they both come with the same kind of programs, like Windows XP comes with Paint, Windows 7 comes with Paint. They function pretty similar. They come with, let's say, Wordpad. Now, the version of Wordpad for Windows 7 compared to the version of Wordpad for XP, they actually have this redesigned in Windows 7 compared to the XP one. It functions really similar. For the most part, it does all the same stuff. Now, the default font was changed, but for the most part, they do all the same stuff. The one in Windows 7 is just a different user interface. Like, this is the ribbon interface up here, where the Windows XP one has a classic menu bar interface. Not that much difference though in reality. Let's take a quick look at games bundled with both operating systems. So for the games, they aren't present in the professional version of Windows 7. You can turn them on, but I don't have them turned on. But the games they include in Windows 7 for the most part was just ported over from Windows XP. The only exception that I really know of is Windows 7 as a 3D chess game, which was just ported over from Windows Vista, which was obviously proudly copied from Mac OS, which had a chess game before Windows Vista. Windows XP doesn't have a chess game. Now, what Windows XP does have is 3D Pinball, which I love. Windows 7 and Windows Vista, for that matter, don't have 3D Pinball. I read somewhere it's because they just couldn't get 3D Pinball to work in Windows 7 or Windows Vista, and that's why they didn't include it, even though, people have released the exe file on the internet, and it quite clearly does work in Windows 7, so I don't know why they didn't include it in Windows 7, but whatever. And the best game of Windows XP, in my opinion, was 3D Pinball, so I kind of wish they didn't remove it in Windows Vista and Windows 7, but, whatever. Looking at other parts of the operating system, Windows 7 doesn't come with a built-in mail client. Windows XP does. It comes with Outlook Express. Windows Vista actually came with a built-in mail client called Windows Mail. Windows 7, for some reason, just doesn't come with a built-in mail client, even though you can download, or you could be able to download, but you can't download it officially anymore. You could download like Windows Live Mail 2012 for Windows 7, but the link to that on Microsoft's website isn't there anymore. But I don't get why they didn't include a built-in mail client in Windows 7, because both Windows 8 and Windows 10 have built-in mail clients. Now Windows 7, unlike Windows XP, had a built-in DVD maker, which is nice, and Windows 7 also comes with Windows Media Player, which this is Windows Media Player 12, I believe. Let me show you guys real quickly what it looks like. Where Windows XP originally, I believe, came with Windows Media Player 7, but it can go all the way up to Windows Media Player 11. But for some reason on my version of Windows XP here, it came with Windows Media Player 9. Now, one thing I liked about Windows Media Player 9, and I believe it was the same thing in Windows Media Player 8, is I like the user interface of Windows Media Player 9. I liked it how, I always thought this was cool for some reason, how I can just hide the traditional Windows title bar and menu bar with just a button click, and all of a sudden it looks like a unique application. It doesn't look like a traditional Windows application. That was always my favorite thing about Windows Media Player 9. Now, Windows Media Player 12, on the other hand, it's definitely, I would say it's probably better than Windows Media Player 9. It supports more, I guess, supports more codecs, stuff like that. But they haven't updated Windows Media Player since 2009 with hardly anything. I mean, they've given it new codecs and stuff in Windows 10, but they haven't really updated the user interface for some reason. I'm predicting one of these days in Windows 10 they're just going to get rid of Windows Media Player and force you to use the Movies and TVs app on Windows 10. But whatever. And Windows 7 also came with Windows Media Center, which doesn't exist anymore in Windows 10. And Windows Media Center was nice if you had, let's say, you had a cable or satellite box and you wanted to DVR shows with your computer. If you just got a TV tuner card in your computer, you could record shows from your TV and watch it on your computer, and it was really nice. But you can't do that anymore officially with Windows 10, which kind of sucks. Now, Windows 7 and Windows XP both don't come with antivirus programs by default. Windows 7 actually does come with, I guess, technically an anti-spyware program called Windows Defender. But the thing about Windows Defender and Windows 7 was that it only checks for like spyware and stuff like that. So if you wanted an actual antivirus program from Windows 7, you had to go on the internet and download one. The one I opted to download for this copy of Windows 7 is Microsoft Security Essentials. And Security Essentials is pretty decent. It's pretty similar to Windows Defender on Windows 8 and Windows 10, which actually do scan for viruses. Windows XP, by comparison, did not have any built-in antivirus, anti-spyware, anti-malware protection at all. But you could download Microsoft Security Essentials for Windows XP up until around April of 2015, and then Microsoft discontinued support for it. But what I have running on this copy of XP is Avira is still supported for it. And in my opinion, in Windows, you should use antivirus no matter what. There are people on like Reddit and websites like that who say you don't need an antivirus program anymore in Windows. I disagree. Windows is still the world's most popular desktop operating system, and there are always security holes in Windows. I mean, you hear about security holes in Windows so much, and in my opinion, it's just safer to get an antivirus program for Windows. Now, do you need like Norton or McAfee or any of these paid antivirus programs? No. But what I do recommend doing if you're on Windows 7, Windows 8.1, or Windows 10 is just download Windows Defender. good enough. Just to be on the safe side, do a manual scan with Malwarebytes every now and again for types of viruses and malware that Windows Defender simply won't catch. Malwarebytes will probably pick it up, and you should be safe that way. But in my opinion, if you're running Windows, you need antivirus no matter what, basically. Even if you don't go to shady sites, I've been to websites with ads before that have literally given me viruses just by visiting the website with these rogue ads, and I just don't recommend not running an antivirus in Windows. Now, something that I like about Windows 7, believe it or not, that Windows XP didn't really have is Windows 7 has something called the user account control. Let me go ahead and bring it up here on Windows 7. And I like the idea of the Windows user account control because the way administrative privileges were handled on Windows XP sucked, to say the very least, because you see, here's a problem on Windows XP. Like, I've gone plenty of viruses, and if you just went to a website and, you visited a website that could give you a virus, basically, it could automatically download and automatically install on your computer because Windows XP's version of user account control, well, they basically didn't have very good administrative access control, to say the very least. Windows XP had auto-run enabled by default, and if stuff could auto-run and you were logged in with an administrator account, basically, if it was a virus that was attempting to auto-run or malware, you're screwed. Windows 7, they sort of fixed this problem by requiring pretty much any program that wants to make administrative changes to your computer to ask you first by the form of a pop-up saying, do you want to allow this program to make changes to your computer? And I've barely got any viruses at all or malware at all on Windows 7 or Windows 10 compared to the amount I got on Windows XP. Now, what they recommended you do back in the Windows XP days, in order to avoid getting viruses and malware, besides disabling auto-run, they also recommended that you just log in with a standard user account instead of using the administrator account in Windows. But no one ever did that because no one liked having to log out and log back in to an administrator account to do anything requiring administrative privileges on their computer. Windows 7, they figured out a way around this, so basically, you could be logged in as a standard user, but anytime a program required administrative privileges, it would ask for an administrator user account and password. And for the most part, even if you're logged in as administrator on Windows 7, it's still going to ask you whether you want to make changes to your computer or not. So it is just a lot harder in Windows Vista and later to get viruses and malware thanks to the user account control. So at the end of the day, which operating system would I recommend you use and which one do I personally like better? Well, I'm going to say Windows 7 for both because even though one thing I do like about Windows XP a lot better than I did in Windows 7 is that it requires so much less system resources to run on your computer. Even though I said earlier that I recommend an absolute minimum of 2 gigabytes of RAM for Windows XP, it's still a lot lower than the amount of RAM that I recommended for Windows 7, which is 8 gigabytes of RAM. You can run Windows XP perfectly fine on older computers. Windows 7 I really wouldn't recommend running on any computers from before like 2007 or 2008, where Windows XP you can run on computers from like 2001, 2002, 2003. But Windows 7 is more stable in my experience. It is more secure, and unlike Windows XP where support was discontinued in April of 2014, Windows 7 support will extend all the way to January of 2020 and still runs on most modern hardware. Now, like I said in one of my past videos, if you're buying a brand new Intel processor or AMD processor, Windows 7, it will probably run on there, but you won't be able to get Windows updates because Microsoft, in my opinion, is probably an anti-consumer company. But Windows 7 basically also supports pretty much any modern application except, if you want to use Microsoft Edge or any Windows Store exclusive apps. So basically, I think there's no reason not to run Windows 7 over Windows XP unless you have a really old computer that can't run Windows XP. But Windows 7, man, Windows 7, because in Windows 7 they didn't really focus on adding too many features. They just beefed up the stability and security of 7 compared to Windows Vista. Basically, Windows 7 is just Windows Vista refined, but that's a very good thing because Windows 7 is an extremely polished operating system, probably one of the best, if not the best operating system Microsoft's ever created. And I have a feeling that Windows 7 is going to be the new Windows XP if it isn't already, because Windows 7, a lot of people like Windows 7 the exact same reason they liked Windows XP. For the most part, it's fast, it's stable, it's just an overall polished operating system. I do think Windows 7 is more polished than XP, but I think once support for Windows 7 ends in 2020, we're going to run into the exact same problems, if not maybe even a little worse than Windows XPs that we ran into with Windows XP. A good chunk of the world, probably over 25% of computers, will still be running Windows 7, even though you can technically still upgrade to Windows 10 for free. And basically, I think the end of support for Windows 7 is going to be a heck of a lot worse than it was for Windows XPs. I bet you anything that Microsoft is going to sort of do what they did with Windows XP, and if you're a big business, like a big business, and you want to pay for extended support for Windows 7, I bet you anything Microsoft's going to let you do that. But Windows XP on the other end is over. Support ended over 3 years ago for this, so I really wouldn't recommend, even if you can get it to work running Windows XP on a modern computer, just stick with Windows 7 or newer. So yeah, I really do like Windows 7 though. It's probably, even though I do like Windows 10, the thing I like about Windows 7 is that it is just such a polished operating system, and I can see why people wouldn't want to bother moving from Windows 7 to Windows 10. Alright guys, that was today's video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys next time, and make sure to check out my social media links because I really do have fun interacting with you guys on all these platforms. You know, I never thought that I would be a YouTuber that would even reach 100 subscribers. So to have almost 10,000 subscribers, that's a big deal to me. That's like, the high school that I went to had 2,000 people attending there. So it's almost like the amount of people that are subscribed to my channel, it's almost like 5 times the amount of people that were in my high school. And that's really cool to me. And so yeah, I hope to see you guys next time. Goodbye.